Khrushchev was not a hero or a traitor. He was just the one who dared to be the first to strike while the idol was still standing. Every word he said was like a hammer on a high wall. It may not have been able to bring it down completely, but it was a crack that history could no longer ignore. The truth about Khrushchev's feud with Stalin. In the labyrinth of Soviet history, Khrushchev's relationship with Stalin is like a red courtroom drama full of dramatic tension. He was a great believer in Stalin, but after the death of the Godfather, he personally unmasked the horror and pulled down the idol. But the question arises, was he a true reformer or a winner of political calculations? In the beginning, he was the most obedient. In the years of Stalin's rule, Khrushchev climbed to the pinnacle of power, not by a sudden surge of talent, but by unconditional loyalty. He did not hesitate to side with Stalin in the Moscow purges, and even took part in the purges himself. He once said, "Stalin's word is an order." He had also signed life and death orders for countless people on the purge lists. Khrushchev was a typical institutionalizer, smooth, enthusiastic, and obedient. He was always the first to applaud at the annual meetings of the Moscow City Council, and at the party congresses, he applauded the longest and laughed the loudest. In Stalin's Soviet Union, loyalty was the highest virtue, but blind loyalty was the rule. Khrushchev, the man who later opened a valve in the Soviet Union from the red pressure cooker, was almost branded as a weakling in Stalin's later years. He was already the first secretary of the Moscow City Council, and belonged to the inner circle of his closest ministers. But in the pressure cooker of Soviet politics, even if you climbed onto the lid of the pot, if you said the wrong thing, you could be cooked instantly. So what exactly did Khrushchev do that made the iron-blooded Stalin frown and even want to get rid of him? Back in 1951, the storm of purges resumed. Stalin was in his 70s, but he was still paranoid. He started the purges all over again, naming names in the Moscow Party. At a high-level meeting, Stalin suddenly changed his tune, saying that enemies are hidden in Moscow, and that organizational reorganization was needed. This was a shock. Many people began to scramble to expose and try to protect themselves. The situation escalated rapidly, and Khrushchev's position became dangerous. As first secretary of the Moscow City Council, he became the first to be tortured. Stalin even said by name, "You are responsible for Moscow's problems. In other words, you either hand over the others or you are the enemy. I am against another round of purges." Khrushchev's shocking move. Faced with Stalin's hint, Khrushchev did not follow it. Instead of drawing up lists and writing black materials like other cadres, he tried to use administrative means to gently deal with those cadres who were suspected. At that time, this was a death wish. What is even more outrageous is that he made a shocking statement at an internal seminar in front of other top officials. "We can no longer engage in endless denunciation struggle, which is harmful to the party's prestige." The words reached Stalin's ears, and the atmosphere changed instantly. Stalin's attitude toward Khrushchev began to grow cold, and he even said openly and sarcastically at a meeting, "You're too soft, you don't have the spirit of class struggle." In 1952, a secret document flowed through the party hierarchy with Stalin's approval. Khrushchev suffers from a lack of organizational discipline and wavering positions, and must be subjected to increased scrutiny. In that murderous political climate, the word weakling was not just a humiliation, but a possible prelude to Rabyanka prison. Khrushchev, realizing that the situation was not good, immediately kept a low profile to protect himself, while reviewing and maintaining verbal loyalty to Stalin, and at the same time quietly replacing a number of officials who would make trouble. The government was not able to do anything about the situation. Interestingly, although Stalin was dissatisfied, he did not move him immediately. The reason was probably that Khrushchev was good enough. Khrushchev was obedient enough and useful enough to be a balancer at critical moments. But after this incident, Khrushchev obviously shrunk. He hardly ever spoke out in public, and rarely participated in high-level political debates. It was only after Stalin's death that everyone realized that the man who had been called soft had actually hidden a backbone. Khrushchev talked about this in his oral memoirs in his later years, and his tone was heavy. "At that time we were all very afraid, one wrong word may be dead. But I knew that one more purge and the party would be finished." This statement reveals his real situation in the midst of totalitarian oppression. He wanted to live but did not want to do the dirty work at the same time. This is why, after Stalin's death, Khrushchev became the first and most determined to promote the thaw and de-Stalinization. Because he had seen too much how innocent people were dragged away in the early hours of the morning, how cadres who would hold meetings disappeared overnight, how those who kissed asses upwards went to jail the next day. That's why he repeatedly emphasized, we can't go back to those days. He is not a soft bone, he is a survivor dancing on a tightrope. Some people call him an opportunist, some call him a wallflower. But if we look back to the black years, you'll see, under the totalitarian system of loyalty is life, dissent is death. A person who can quietly patch the system without being shot is an anomaly in itself. Khrushchev's soft bones may be the kind of backbone that can be bent but not broken. And this kind of soft with hard posture, eventually after he became the first secretary, exploded into a series of shocking reform moves. But no one would have guessed that such a conformist would later become the man who tore apart Stalin's myths. Why hand to help God's people? And hand to tear down the altar of God? Behind this is the complex psychology of Khrushchev. Both hate but also understand Stalin. In his mind, Stalin was a leader, a teacher, but also a ghost that made people afraid and even ashamed. In the secret report he said, "We can't put the whole blame on the people. It was Stalin's fault, his decision alone." Terror, systematically created. This was his way of atoning for his own sins and excusing the transformation of the country. But deeper than that, it was Khrushchev's fear of dictatorship. He didn't want anyone else to be like Stalin, who decided people's lives and deaths on a whim. But this demythologizing ceremony was not complete. He de-Stalinized, but did not dare to reject it completely. Interestingly, while criticizing Stalin, Khrushchev was reluctant to cut off the achievements of the Stalinist era, such as the victory in World War II and the miracle of industrialization. He tried to draw a strange line. Stalin was great in the first period, authoritarian in the second. The victory of the Soviet Union was for the people, not for the dictatorship. Some say Khrushchev criticized Stalin for self-preservation. After all, he had been part of the purges, and if he hadn't preempted them, he would have been liquidated sooner or later. Others say it was a sign of his true awakening. After seeing the cruelty of the system, he tried to loosen the bonds of the state in a limited way. But whatever his motives, he was the first and only Soviet leader who dared to criticize his predecessor on stage. This was something that not even Gorbachev, who came later, was able to replicate. Khrushchev tore apart decades of Soviet communist political mythology with a single report. What was the greatest characteristic of the Stalinist era? Fear. One wrong word and you could be reported. A single misspelled word could lead to 10 years of reform through labor. Even top party officials were insecure and could be killed at the drop of a hat. When Khrushchev came to power, he called a halt to mass political purges. He abolished countless labor camps and rehabilitated thousands of falsely accused enemies of the people. He even pushed for the release of a large number of wrongly convicted political prisoners and their reintegration into society. This was a mild but violent institutional earthquake in a time of great uncertainty. Soviet literature under Stalin was monotonous: factories, steel, heroism, and the people must always smile. Khrushchev said, "Let some different voices come to life." Works such as What Happened to a Man and A Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich were published. Some writers began to carefully portray the inner struggles of ordinary people. Movies stopped just shouting slogans and told stories. Although he could be erratic, he later criticized some artists, for example. This period became known as the Khrushchev thaw. It opened up a crack in the Soviet intelligentsia and youth, allowing air to flow. In Khrushchev's time, the Soviets finally dared to laugh. At the end of the 1950s and the beginning of the 60s, there was a quiet underground trend in the streets of the USSR. Not literature, not fashion, but telling Khrushchev jokes. This was a rare form of humor with a spark at a time when punishment by words was the norm. It was also a secret psychological liberation.